procedure?
But that's an interpretation clause. That's not a clause to amend the Constitution. I mean, I don't understand, Manoj. I mean, obviously, I've gone something wrong in my understanding of the plain reading of the section, Manoj.
When 4 is brought in, if your argument is right, then the original insertion of 367(4) is also invalid.
No.
When Article 356 is in operation, how will you effectuate clause 4 to Article 370 clause 1, according to you?
Every executive act is constitutionally flawed, impermissible.
Clause D to section 371.
Yes.
The president, by an order, can make modifications to the provisions of the Constitution as they apply to that state.
Well, please, I'm sorry to interrupt your lordship, but read the first part. Such of the other provisions of this Constitution.
Correct, I'm coming to that.
The modifications can only be.
We have understood that. Just for the time being, just leave that argument apart, because one way to interpret clause C to section 3, Article 371 is that it is only saying 1, and 370 will certainly apply to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. D refers to such other provisions of the Constitution shall apply in relation to the state, subject to such exceptions and modifications as the President may by an order specify. For the time being, we are referring to 367, because the power under 367, there was 367(4), which was applicable even at the time of in 2019. There was clause 4 of Article 367, which was certainly applicable at the time, even in 2019.
Yes.
Now, if in order to make modification to that clause,
Yes.
during when 356 is invoked, what will be the procedure?
But that's an interpretation clause. That's not a clause to amend the Constitution. I mean, I don't understand, Manoj. I mean, obviously, I've gone something wrong in my understanding of the plain reading of the section, Manoj. Obviously, I'm completely wrong. But with greatest respect, Manoj, that's an interpretation clause.
Interpretation clause cannot be amended.
No, by interpretation clause, you can't amend 370. That's the power, with great respect, Manoj. You can't substitute the legislative assembly, constitute a legislative assembly. What has that got to do with interpretation? What you can't do directly, you can't do indirectly, Manoj. And where does the president get that power when it says such of the other provisions of the Constitution shall apply in relation to the state subject to such that means other provisions of the Constitution you can have exceptions and modifications, not exception and modification 370. So I will not amend 370, but I will amend 367 to amend 370. With the greatest respect.
In your argument on that as well, 367(4). One second. 367(4) was brought in for the first time not with the Constitution, but in 1954. Right? So when 367(4) is brought in, if your argument is right, then the original insertion of 367(4) is also invalid.
No. That was interpretation. Manoj, this is Damru. That's a case directly on point where your lordships have said governor was always known to be the governor. Sadr-e Riyasat was only the name. The argument was Sadr-e Riyasat prior to 1965 had to be elected.
Right.
But that's straight away. Had to be elected. But in fact, now the governor was directly appointed by the president, right? He didn't have to be elected. So merely because there's a change of nomenclature, but if you change the substance of 370, considerations would be entirely different.
That's a submission.
That's held by your lordship. So let's not. There was no fundamental alteration there. Here there's a fundamental alteration. What you can't do directly, your lordships are now saying that let's look at 367. It's hard to find an alleyway to reach a logical conclusion. One can try very hard. Manoj, I get lost when I go to my own.
Let's put it very simply.
Lost in alleyways, Manoj.
Let's put it very simply. When Article 356 is in operation, how will you effectuate clause 4 to Article 370 clause 1, according to you?
I will, Malad. Please let me reach that stage. I've tried to answer all your questions so far, Malad. I'll answer that also.
So now we have seen the that notification of 5th of August and the original Article 367.
370, please remember. It says, notwithstanding anything in this constitution at the beginning, and then it says, notwithstanding anything in the foregoing provisions. 356 doesn't begin with that, with a non-obstante clause. It's important to know that even 373 says, notwithstanding the above provisions. So it's notwithstanding of notwithstanding. So then how do you exercise that power in any other way? 366 has to be subject to 370. Doesn't say notwithstanding any provision of the Constitution, I can do what I like. Well, then you go back to Malad's, what we tried to get rid of in 1950. So there is no legislature, there is no legislative assembly. Governor has dissolved on the 21st of November, the assembly. You have to introduce the bill only with the consent, concurrence of the legislature. You introduce the bill contrary to the article. Because he says this is suspended, nothing exists. But by this time it's dissolved. How do you do that? Every executive act is constitutionally flawed, impermissible. It's a violation of the fundamentals of constitutional law.
Yes.
First proviso says that provided that no bill for the purpose shall be introduced in either House of Parliament except on the recommendation of the President, and unless where the proposal contained in the bill affects the area boundaries named as states, the bill has been referred by the President to the legislature for expressing its views thereon. So the first proviso dealt with in other states like Telangana when they were created. It had to go to the legislature for expression of views. Government of India may not. Parliament may not agree with those views. That's, of course, the power of Parliament given by the Constitution itself. So they introduced a bill without the legislative consent. I'll come to the reorganization bill later, but I just wanted to mention, because we're on this list of dates, that this itself could not have been done. Now let's kindly come back to my volume 2, written submissions. Let's skip this one. Yeah.